Karen, I think you're muted.
I am very sorry. Somehow I muted myself and my screen would not allow me to do anything. Are you guys able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I will try this. I was on a roll. I was saying everything. um, and if my screen gets locked up again, if y'all don't see me doing anything, it's because my screen got locked up. But let's try this again. Is there anybody monitoring to see if we are still on live? Okay, we are. All righty. Y'all be patient with us out there in YouTube land. And I think what happens when I go to full screen is when there ends up being a problem. So I am not going to go to full screen. So back to who we are. The Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement are a Facebook-based group, a Facebook-based community group established in 2020. And it's comprised of descendants whose ancestors were sold by the Maryland Jesuits to Louisiana slaveholders in 1838, commonly referred to as the GU 272. And most people don't know this, but the GU 272 was actually a hashtag that was created by students at Georgetown in 2015 when they found out that two of the priests whose names were on buildings at Georgetown had actually sold people to Louisiana. And that's where the GU 272 comes from. But in actuality, the Jesuits sold more than 300 people in that 1838 sale. Not all of them came to Louisiana, but there were more than 300 people sold. And they continue to own people in Maryland even after that sale. We also are comprised of descendants whose ancestors were owned by the Maryland Jesuits or other Catholic institutions, such as the Order of the Visitation or the Society of the Sacred Heart. And again, many of those ancestors remained in Maryland, and we have connected with some of those descendants on our regular Thursday calls. We're also comprised of descendants whose ancestors were owned by prominent Catholic families from locations such as Maryland, Louisiana, Kentucky, and Missouri. Some of the work that we've done over these last 2.5 years has shown us that there are DNA connections with families from these locations who attended these Jesuit churches. And then lastly, descendants with DNA connections to any of the previously mentioned groups. And so when we come on every week, we're looking at the research and trying to figure out our connections. Okay. Some of the family groups we're looking at are the Adams family. We don't know a whole lot more about them, but we know that some of them came to Louisiana, and we know that there are probably many more who remained in Maryland. The Browns, there were some Brown children who were a part of that sale. They were actually connected to the Ford family. Henny Butler Ford had children previous to this sale by someone who was a Brown in Maryland. And so we would definitely love to learn more about the Ford family. The Harris family is a very large family who came to Louisiana. We have to believe there's a lot more left in Maryland. The Jones family, we don't know a whole lot about the Joneses. We definitely want to learn more. The Plowden Hill family, that's another large family. The Ware family, we definitely see the DNA connections with the Ware family. A lot of Louisianans are finding connections to the Barnes families that remained in Maryland. My husband's family comes from the Butlers. We definitely want to learn a lot more. There's something odd going on with that family. The Goff family was a part of the sale, but they didn't actually come to Louisiana. They remained in Maryland. Harrison family, we do see the DNA connections between the Harrisons in Louisiana and Maryland. The Mahoney family, we're going to be talking more about the Mahoneys later on tonight. It's a Butler family married into a Mahoney family here in Louisiana, but the Mahoneys were split up into 3 different parishes here in Louisiana. There were some that remained in Maryland. They remained with the Jesuits, and others who were supposed to be with as a part of this sale, the Jesuits sold off to other Maryland slaveholding families. The Queen family, we have Kevin on the call tonight. He's shared a lot of information about the Queen family. He does a lot of research about the Queen family. And then there's the Wendery family and the Blacklock families. They married into the large Hawkins family. The Campbell family, many of them ended up in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. We know that there are many more in Maryland. The Greenleaf family, they I think ended up in Ascension Parish. We would love to learn more. The Hawkins family is a large family. They married into many of these other families. Almost all the other families have some connection to the Hawkins family. My husband's also a Hawkins. The Merrick family, we don't know much about. We would love to learn more. We have a lot of members of the Scott family who married into several of the other families. And then the Yorkshire family. Some came to Louisiana, some remained in Maryland, were subsequently sold. And we are absolutely seeing the DNA connections to those families. So what we do, we meet every Thursday night at 7 p.m. Central Time. We share best practices so that everyone can learn some of the best ways to do the research. We explore Jesuit enslavement history. We don't just talk about the 1838 sale. We dive deep into other parts of Jesuit enslavement history. And we discuss other genealogical discoveries, and we review our genetic connections to some of the different families. So next, we're going to have Nagesh Rucker come on and talk a little bit about Reverend Harry Mahoney, who's from Louisiana. Now, I'm going to try making my screen go full screen. If we get stuck, I might have to stop and reshare.
Okay. Hey, everyone. My name's Nagesh Rucker. I am a descendant of Louisa Mahoney, who was enslaved at St. Inigo's by the Maryland Jesuits. One of my deep dive explorations in this history is to explore other Mahoney connections. Over the past year, we have found a lot of DNA connections to Mahoneys who are not associated with the 1838 sale. We found DNA connections to Mahoneys who were free much earlier, in some cases in the 18th century. And so I've been trying to deep dive into what those connections might look like for those of us who have ties to Jesuit enslavement. One of the more recent finds was learning about Louisiana State Representative Henry Mahoney, who's pictured here. We could go to the next slide. And just wanted to learn a little bit more about him. So who was he? Harry Mahoney was the longest serving African-American in Plaquemines Parish to serve in the Louisiana state legislature. We did find he had a long list of accomplishments. He served during the Reconstruction era. He was a member of the 1868 Louisiana State Constitution Convention. He served on the Louisiana State Legislature from 1870 to 1896. He was chairman of the Claims and Public Building Committee, and he was also elected to the Plaquemines Parish School Board. He held the positions of president, treasurer, and secretary. And prior to holding elected office, Representative Mahoney was deputy sheriff in Plaquemines Parish. All of these things are remarkable because Harry Mahoney was born enslaved, and he did not know how to read and write, taught himself how to read and write while serving as deputy sheriff in Plaquemines Parish. Representative Mahoney collaborated frequently with other Reconstruction era leaders. He worked with State Senator Edward Butler and PBS Pinchback, who was the first Black governor of Louisiana, elected in 1872. We know we just talked a little bit about the Butler family. It's a theory that Edward Butler may also be connected to the Butlers from Maryland, although we have not yet explored that. Mahoney also collaborated with Pinchback while he served on the Republican State Central Committee of Louisiana. And Representative Mahoney and State Senator Butler sponsored Act 12 of Louisiana legislature to repeal Act 22. This moved the seat of justice and courthouse from Point Alahaj to Jesuits Bend, and the act was approved and signed into law February 25th, 1871. You see a snap shot of that, that bill over to the right. Okay. So outside of his work as a state legislator, Mahoney was pastor of the First African Baptist Church of the 6th District, and he was a well-regarded speaker. I just have a couple snippets here from newspapers announcing him speaking, all of his speaking engagements. They were numerous. Again, remarkable for someone who had taught himself to read in his late 20s. He would often speak at different churches. He often spoke of the responsibility for Black people at that time to advocate for themselves, and to, as it says there, the young man's duty to race uplift was a topic, a favorite topic of his that you see him speaking about often. Okay, we can go to the next slide. There we go. So my open question, of course, for all Black people that I find with the last name Mahoney is, could Representative Mahoney be connected to the Mahoney family from Maryland? So we took a chance at exploring this and try to see if there was anything in the documentation that would reveal this. So in order to do that, we went back to the sale of 1838, and the sale proved devastating for the Mahoney family for a lot of different reasons. First, parents Harry and Anna Mahoney were scheduled to be sold to Louisiana along with their children, Bibiana, Harry, Nellie, Gabriel, known as Gabe, Daniel, Louisa, and Anna. Bibiana, who's not listed on the snippet to the right, but she's listed in the sales document with her husband, Nace, and their children were sold to Iberville Parish. Anna and her son, Arnold Jr., was sold to Ascension Parish. Louisa and her mother, Anna, avoided being transported by hiding in the swamp near the St. Inigo's plantation. But let's be clear, although Louisa and Anna were not sold to Louisiana, they were re-enslaved by the Jesuits at St. Inigo's Plantation, and Louisa was not emancipated until emancipation came to Maryland in 1864. So though Harry and Gabe were scheduled to be sold to Louisiana, the records indicate they were married off. What we found is that oftentimes when the records say married off, it means that the Jesuits sold them to other enslavers. And so we found some additional records in the Georgetown Slavery Archive. I know that's a little small and hard to see, but Gabe Mahoney was sold to Colonel John Harris of St. Mary's County, and Harry Jr. was sold to William Smith, also of St. Mary's. When I reviewed the 1870 census record for Harry Mahoney, I noticed that he self-identified as having been born in Maryland. I also noticed that that self-identification continues for each census record available to him. So 1880, 1900, and 1910. Then there was a very lengthy article from the Times-Democrat newspaper dated September 28th, 1913, that talks about Mahoney. Now, the Times-Democrat was a rather overtly racist at that time newspaper, but it featured Harry Mahoney having faced a decline of his political career. But in this article, he clearly states about having been enslaved as a child by the Harris family in St. Mary's County, Maryland, which again is the same family, I believe, as the family Gabriel Mahoney was sold to in 1839 by the Jesuits. So given this information, I think it's possible that Representative Harry Mahoney may be the son of Gabriel Mahoney. And if this holds true, this is a sort of a snapshot of the Mahoney descendants, the descendants of Harry and Anna. You see them here, and we see Gabriel in the middle there. If we go to the next slide, we would see that we have Representative Harry Mahoney as a descendant of Gabriel Mahoney. What I also failed to mention was that after Representative Mahoney was emancipated, he found his brother, one of whom was named James, living in Plaquemine Parish, and they both bought land there and raised families. Harry married a woman named Harriet Sully. They had a daughter named Louisa Mahoney, and I have been unable to find Louisa Mahoney's husband's name, but she had a son named Harry Stewart. If we go to the next slide, we can see Harry is with his grandfather, Harry Mahoney, in the 1900 census record there in red. Again, we see him identified. Can you go back? Thanks. You see him identified as being born in Maryland, parents both born in Maryland, and his occupation is as a preacher. So I believe he was still pastoring the 6th District Church at that time.
And so, Naguess, I just want to go back to this slide here, where we see the names. I always talk about the naming patterns. We see Harry, we saw Louisa, and it's just not coincidence that Reverend Harry would have some of these same names within his family here in Louisiana. And I think that's just something for people to pay attention to when they are, doing their research.
That's right. The names repeat constantly. And even men who I believe by DNA evidence, we have assumed to be Harry Mahoney's father, who was Robert. Robert's other sons are also named Gabriel and Daniel. And the daughters are also named Nellie and Louisa, and Daniel. So the names are certainly do repeat over and over again. And we see the same repetition. The name Charles Mahoney is repeated in all of the different Mahoney groups, including those who were free much earlier than emancipation and the documentation. So these family names, I believe people are choosing these family names because they want to remember the brothers, sisters, extended family members that had been lost as a tragedy of chattel slavery in America.
And I know you and I have talked at length about this particular family, and it's definitely, it's a theory, but we have all of this corroborating information that's helping us as we try to prove this theory. And one of the things we're hoping to find is more DNA evidence that helps us to prove this theory. I have come across some DNA connections, some people who have Reverend Harry's brother in their tree. They don't have Reverend Harry, but they have their brother Robert, and they are from Oakville, Louisiana. But I haven't, they show up in the DNA of someone who is connected to my family, a family that married into my grandmother's family, actually, long after I was born. But if we get more people to DNA tests, especially more people from Plaquemine Parish, Louisiana, hopefully we'll begin to see some more connections, because these would be, if this Harry Mahoney is connected to our Harry Mahoney, I'm thinking it could go back to our, I guess Gabriel, we assume is this Gabriel, but it could be a different Gabriel, but we assume it's this Gabriel. That would make their common ancestor, Harry and Anna Mahoney, who were a part of the sale, but who actually didn't come to Louisiana. So it could be a very distant DNA match. And as you know, if that DNA match is below 8 centimorgans on Ancestry, it's not going to show up because they removed those low centimorgan matches. So these could be some matches that were there before. And although we see many DNA connections between Louisiana Mahonies and Maryland Mahonies, that could be as a result of what I often call compounded DNA, where some of the other families are married into them. But it's very possible that Reverend Harry Mahoney, who came to Louisiana, he may have been isolated from some of the other families in Southern Maryland, St. Mary's County, Maryland. So many of the families are related to each other in multiple ways. But if Reverend Harry was moved to Louisiana outside of all of those other families, then some of that compounded DNA may not be there. And that could account for why we may not be seeing his descendants in the DNA. And we may be seeing his descendants because he had a daughter. And oftentimes daughters' last names get lost. So I believe if we get more and more people tested, we may see some of the DNA show up as we go on. Did anybody have any other questions about what Nagesh just presented? And if you do, you can just go on and speak because I can't see you. Nagesh, was there anything else you wanted to add about this presentation?
I think that's it. I do think that this is just a wonderful example of leadership and people eager to advance themselves and advocate for themselves coming out of the horrors of enslavement. And I'm just, I'm so incredibly impressed with what he's done, and I'm hoping that we can find descendants so that if they don't know about him, they can learn about him and have this source of pride that I think those of us who have kind of adopted him, although we're not exactly sure if we're related to him or not. I want other people to feel that, take pride in that as well. And so I'm excited to see if we can find his descendants, and also looking forward to learning more about State Representative or State Senator Edward Butler, who he also worked with.
And I just will say, I discovered this information when one of my Facebook friends posted. He had visited a museum in Phoenix, Louisiana, that's run by Reverend Tyrone Edwards, and he had pictures up of State Representative Edward Butler and Harry Mahoney. And when I saw that, I'm like, oh, I got to share this with the guest. I was so excited, and our research will continue. But next week, I'm going to go visit that museum in Phoenix, Louisiana, which is in Plaquemines Parish, and hopefully begin to meet some of the people in Plaquemines Parish and Oakville and share this history with them, and hopefully encourage them to do more family history research and do some DNA testing so that we can see if there are some connections. So anyone else on the call had any questions? And those who are in the live chat, thank you for joining us. I am monitoring the chat. If you have any questions, even once we move on to, Kevin's going to present next, but once we move on to Kevin, if you have some questions, just put them in the chat and we can double back and get those questions answered. Okay, Kevin, and I think you're up next. And you'll have to unmute yourself. Okay.
Right. Good evening, everyone. Let me get situated here. I've done this before. Got too many windows open.
Yeah, it gets kind of persnickety when we're broadcasting, it seems. And of course, if you're like me with lots of windows open, it's hard to find the window you want. And while you're getting set up, Kevin, I will just go on and introduce you. Kevin Porter does a lot of research on the Queen family, but also White Marsh history and some of the other locations around Maryland where the Jesuits enslaved people.
Okay. All right. So good evening, everyone. So tonight I want to talk about some of the early ancestors of Jesuit enslavement, particularly from the White Marsh Plantation. So as early as 1634, the Jesuits arrived in Maryland on the Ark and Dove and established the first Jesuit mission in the American colonies. Between 1634 and 1838, they had 10 missions in Maryland, 8 that we know of that held enslaved families, mainly White Marsh Plantation in Prince George's County, the Bohemia Plantation in Cecil County, Maryland, Port Tobacco, which became known as St. Thomas Manor in Port Tobacco, Charles County, Deer Creek in Harford County, Maryland, St. Joseph Missions on the Eastern Shore, Georgetown College, which was established by Archbishop John Carroll in 1789. Newtown, which is one of the oldest missions, established in St. Mary's County, and the first mission, which was established by Father Andrew White in 1634, St. Inigo's. To date, I don't, and someone in the chat or someone can chime in, I haven't seen any evidence of Jesuit enslavement at Frederick Mission or at Woodstock. I know there were enslaved sent to Woodstock, but I haven't uncovered families there to date. So tonight I'm going to highlight some of the early ancestors of the White Marsh Plantation. These numbers just represent, they don't have any special meaning. I'm just putting all the Jesuit missions in alphanumeric establishing codes for them. So A is White Marsh, B is Bohemia. I've tried to the best extent possible to have the letters align with the name of the plantation, but so here's a brief timeline. I won't go through the whole history, but the White Marsh Plantation was bequeathed to the Jesuits by a wealthy merchant planter named James Carroll. He was a descendant of the wealthy Carroll family, an Irish Catholic American family that migrated to the Americas. They had close ties with the proprietary governor, Lord Baltimore, the Calvert family. He served the Calvert family up through his death. In 1704, he established the Fingal Plantation, built a manor house, and immediately began purchasing slaves, and had enslaved laborers working on tobacco plantations in Anne Arundel County. As in 1715, an indentured servant named Mary Queen spent 3 years in England. She entered an indentureship with Captain Thomas Larkin, who had a partnership in London. Brought her over. James Carroll eventually purchased her indenture. Unfortunately, James Carroll never honored her indentureship, and she was then illegally enslaved. In 1718, James Carroll commissioned a slaving voyage and had a ship built named the Margaret in London, which ventured down to what is now Sierra Leone, transported hundreds of slaves to the Chesapeake, and sold them to local merchant planters. And some of those enslaved families were purchased by the Carroll family, particularly his uncle, Charles Carroll, the settler, who was the first Attorney General of Maryland. By 1722, James Carroll purchased, he was actually granted the White Marsh Plantation, which is now known as the White Marsh Plantation, by Lord Baltimore, which contained 2,000 acres. The slave labor force he had at Fingal, he divided it and transported them to 12 miles up Fingal in Prince George's County, and they began establishing tobacco plantations on this area. When he died, he bequeathed pretty much 95% of his enslaved labor force to the Jesuits. Mary Queen, the matriarch that I mentioned, she was bequeathed to his nephew and sent to the Bohemian mission with her son. And over time, the Queen family and other families from James Carroll Plantation was absorbed into Jesuit enslavement by 1764. There were up to upwards of 25 descendants of Mary Queen enslaved in White Marsh. And but from that group that James Carroll bequeathed to the Jesuits, there were roughly about 3 principal family groups that we can identify to living descendants today. But I'll go through some of the matriarchs. And what I'm doing now, I'm following the maternal lines because by virtue of Maryland law in Virginia, in the Chesapeake, slavery was inherited by the status of your mother. So if your mother was enslaved, then the child became enslaved. So pretty much anyone born on the Jesuit plantations inherited their status from their mom. So I'm following the maternal lines to the best extent possible. So there was Sue. I haven't been able to positively identify living descendants or her children, but I'm sure she had children. Her name appears as Susanna in some of the later Jesuit records, and that name is carried through the Queen family and other families at White Marsh. There was Maria. She was the wife of James Carroll's most entrusted enslaved man, Dick. They had 4 children that we've been able to identify, namely Nell, Peter, Dickie, and Billy. Nell went on to also be have her own family. Betty was the wife of Tomboy, who James Carroll purchased from Colonel Henry Darnall, who was pretty much the proprietary governor. He was the ruled Maryland in place of the Calvert family. Tragically, all of her children died before 1720. Then there was Nanny. Nanny was purchased from the Margaret by James Carroll himself. I believe Jerry may have also been purchased from the Margaret as well. And this brings up a good important point that, so as I mentioned, a lot of the enslaved were purchased from Charles Carroll the settler, which were absorbed into the Carroll family, Charles Carroll descendants, which include his son, Charles Carroll of Annapolis, and Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the signer of the Declaration of Independence. So a lot of the DNA connections we're going to see could be tied from the Margaret sale in 1718. And last but not least, there was Mary Queen. She has 3 children that we can positively identify as her progeny, namely Nanny, Phyllis, and Ralph. So after James Carroll's death, in accordance with his will, Nanny and Ralph were sent to the Bohemian plantation. And as far as we know, they never returned to White Marsh. So we have three principal groups that we pretty much know for certain that have living descendants today. So I've assigned for my own research group numbers for each group. Since Mary Queen is one of the largest matriarchs, I've named her Group 1, A1. Maria and Nell are designated as Group 2. And Nanny's group, E1. And I'll explain later why that I've chosen his name in convention. And that aligns with the St. Joseph mission here, E. So from 1730 to 1764, Nanny and Phyllis, between them, had about roughly 22 children born enslaved at White Marsh. Nell had 5 children. Nell, the daughter of Maria, and Dick had 5 children. Nanny 9, Phyllis 10, and Nanny from the Margaret 5. By 1764, the next generation began to procreate and had children. Nell's daughter, Sal, had 6 children by 1764. I don't have it here, but a lot of Nanny's children began to have children by 1764, namely Mary and Tom. And Tom marries Nanny of the Margaret's daughter, Francis, who the Jesuits called Frank. And they have 4 children by 1764. And so since we're following the maternal line, I've designated this family as E1, as opposed to A1, which is Mary Queen's maternal line. But if we follow, and Frank and Tom Queen's children are in the 3rd generation of Nanny of the Margaret. And if we follow Mary Queen's line, they will be 4th in generation. So in early 1765, Father Joseph Mosley establishes the St. Joseph mission on the Eastern Shore in Talbot County, Cordova, and named it St. Joseph. Very modest man. So Nanny, that's why I've chosen to give her her own grouping number as opposed to White Marsh number, because the progenitor herself gets uprooted from White Marsh and sent to St. Joseph. And as far as we know, they never returned to White Marsh. Lucy, and I don't have her listed here, but Mary was the first child born at Mary Queen of Tom and Frank was the first child born at the St. Joseph mission. and 1765. So Frank was pregnant the time she was forced from White Marsh and sent to the Eastern Shore. Lucy gets sent to Bohemia, and I think she comes back, and Mary gets sent to Bohemia. Nanny's other children, David, number 3, and Henny get sent to Deer Creek Mission in Harford County. David at one point gets sent to the St. Joseph's Mission and joins his brother and his nieces and nephews, but then gets sent back to Deer Creek. And Henny has children born at Deer Creek, and they're eventually born there and enslaved at Deer Creek. I didn't cover Phyllis much, but Phyllis had 10 children. By 1764, she has at least one grandchild born in 1764, Mary, Queen. So by 1830, most of the enslaved at St. Joseph's was either manumitted, bought their freedom, or sold off. The ones that remained in the area still continued working for the Jesuits at the St. Joseph Mission. A lot of them migrated to Delaware, Philadelphia, and other parts of Pennsylvania. Some actually migrated to Baltimore and DC. Reverend Ellsworth Queen was born in Talbot County in 1881. And around his 20s and 30s, he migrated to DC, became a reverend, was the head of a Methodist church in DC. He married Ida Gertrude Nelson. They had 7 children. And tonight I just want to, my call to action. If you're from the Eastern Shore, if you're watching this, you have oral histories about St. Joseph Mission. If you have the Queen name in your pedigree, or you have DNA matches to Queens from the Eastern Shore or from the other Jesuit plantations aforementioned, you can go to www.queenfamily.org, and we're working on a Queen DNA project, and put your contact information in, and we'll try to work out your connection.
Thanks, Kevin. Was that it?
That's it.
Okay, for now. For
Yes,
now,
for
because it's
now.
never it, right?
No.
It's never the end of it. Actually, I don't know, I might have missed it, but one of the things I wanted to make sure we distinguish, there are some queens who don't descend from Mary the Papaw Queen.
Yes.
And at some point, some of those family lines cross. Can you talk just a little bit about them?
Yeah. So before Mary Queen actually arrived in the American colonies, there was a white family who originally came as McQueen, Samuel Queen. They had landholdings and St. Mary's in Charles County. And they were actually connected to the Jesuits in Southern Maryland. But they actually don't have any historical or genetic connections to the descendants of Mary the Pawpaw Queen, who was born in South America, transported by Captain Woodes Rogers in 1709 and sent to England. She lived there for 3 years and then entered indenture with Captain Thomas Larkin in 1714 and arrived in the American colonies in 1715. Some of the African-American families bearing I haven't seen evidence of many, but there's some that have no connections to Mary Queen, and they are likely descendants of enslavement from the descendants of Samuel Queen, his sons Marsh and Queen, and from that history. But another part of the DNA project, what I like to do is disprove or disprove that, that we do have two different, distinct, unique histories. And so far, my research has shown that there are two distinct families from Maryland. With, both have rich history.
Yeah. And the other question I had was, or would ask you to expound more on it, that many of the males kept the Queen's surname.
Yes. So many Phyllis Queen married a man named Simon, enslaved by the Lee family in South River. As most African-American males enslaved in American colonies, they didn't have surnames. Their tribal names were taken away from them. But the Queen, her eldest daughter, Nanny Cooper, that name she was referred to that by that name by the Jesuits and neighboring white families. But her children actually took on the Queen name from their grandmother, Mary Queen. We actually don't know if we don't know what Mary Queen's original name was, but they, according to Benjamin Duval in his deposition, he said that the African Americans enslaved at White Marsh and around said she was a queen in her own country, and she was famously known as the Pawpaw Queen or Queen Mary. So that name stuck with her, and then our name derives from that that moniker that she took. And then the males also took on their mother's names. Even some of the women that married enslaved men at White Marsh and other plantations either didn't acknowledge their last names or didn't have last surnames, so they took their mother's surname, Queen. And that was prevalent up until the 1860s, that males just decided to take their mother's name. So in this DNA project, we can't follow, it's not a typical surname project where you follow the paternal line to a male. It zigzags and twists and turns. So that's why I think it's important to follow the maternal connections, especially since we're dealing with slavery.
Absolutely. Dante has a question.
Yeah, because now that I see your question. No, I haven't been able to connect to, I've seen.
Wait, could you go on and repeat the question just for the
sorry.
people who are on YouTube?
Yeah, have I found any connections to the Queenan surname in Southern Maryland? Not yet. I've seen DNA connections to that family, but it's not kind of aligning with the White Marsh nucleus, so to speak. But yeah, I've been wondering about that.
Okay. Before we move on to the next section, anybody else had any questions?
I did have a question, Kevin. So I know you talked about Mary, the Pawpaw Queen, and her having been an indentured servant and being illegally enslaved. And I always connect that with Anne Joyce, who has the same story, but with her indentured servitude having been stolen by Colonel Henry Darnell. And I'm just wondering if you found any other examples of indentured servants who are women of color having been illegally enslaved, such as Mary and Anne Joyce.
Yeah.
You there, Kevin?
Yes. I was trying to think.
Okay.
So there a number of, I can't think of the top of my head. I've seen a few. But through the freedom suits that I've encountered, most of them are descended from white women and enslaved men. But I have seen a few, not many, but most, I would say 80 to 90% are descended from white women and enslaved men. So it still follows the, I don't want to butcher the Latin term. You can say it better than I can, I guess, but that maternal status.
Okay. If there are no other questions, just before we go on to you, Dante, I just want to put this screen up here.
If Roy had a question,
I'm sorry, somebody else had a question?
Yeah, I've searched Roy and I haven't seen evidence. I'm sure they probably are descendants from that queen family because they were free, you know. A lot of the queens married into other families and surnames changed, but I tend to look. We need to dig deeper into that.
Okay. Did you repeat Roy's question?
I'm sorry. I'm not good at this. did any of the queens immigrate to Liberia?
Okay. Yeah.
And I haven't seen any evidence to date with the queen's surname, but I'm sure that probably some.
Okay. And before we move on to the next section, I just want to put the screen back up here. So we definitely want to speak with descendants who are connected to this history. And so how do you know if you're connected? Do you have family ties to Maryland or any other state with history of Catholic enslavement, such as Maryland, Louisiana, Missouri, or Kentucky? And I will say that we have seen some connections to other parts of Louisiana, such as Grand Couteau, where the Jesuits had a school and an order of sisters also had a school. Or you or did your ancestors identify as Catholic? Do you show DNA connections to individuals associated with the GU 272? And I think I would just also add into that connections in Maryland, especially St. Mary's County, Maryland, Prince George's County, Maryland, Charles County, some of these other counties in Maryland. Does your family lineage include any of the surnames associated with the GU 272 or Jesuit enslavement? And if you go to Jesuit Enslaved on Instagram or to our Facebook page, Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement, you'll see the full surname list. And if you're also trying to reach out to us, you could also send a message through Instagram or through the Facebook group. But you'll see that full surname list. And if you've done your DNA, you have some of these other characteristics. And you don't have to be Catholic because not all the families remain Catholic over the years. But if you do happen to be Catholic in these locations, we are seeing DNA connections to people in other locations as well outside of these. But, with genealogy, the research is never done. And that's why we are together every Thursday night. And we will continue to do that as time goes on. But we definitely want to bring in people who are finding family history connections or DNA connections to this history so that we can continue to research together and learn from each other. And next up, we're going to have Jerome talk a little bit about DNA. We often go deep into DNA. And it's a good place to learn a little bit more. We are all constantly learning. Are you ready, Jerome? Oh, you're ready.
Okay, I guess people can see my screen.
Yeah.
As we've been talking, you kind of hear the word DNA come up more than just a couple of times. It can be a binding thread that might tie a lot of this other very well-researched documentation together, if we can connect the dots. And one of the things that I've been trying to do, and I've had to use my own family as guinea pigs, that's just the way it works, is to try to come up with some advanced techniques that can be employed so that once we get to the point where we think we have found a descendant of a queen, or a descendant of a Butler, or a descendant of a Yorkshire, or whatever the name might happen to be, if we can find that individual, and if they're in Ancestry or one of the other testing companies, get them out of Ancestry and into GEDmatch, where we can see these chromosome matches and the specific segment locations of these matches. We can begin to couple those types of specific information, that type of specific information, marry it with the trees that we're all working on, trying to build our trees back as far as we can build them, and using some due diligence to make sure we're as accurate as we can be. And then we can begin to use some of these advanced tools to try to neck down on pinning these people down using the DNA and making some science-based conclusions. So I won't go into each of these particular slides. I'll probably skim over a couple of them and just kind of do a brief, shorter synopsis of what I have here to give you some idea of what visual phasing might be able to do to add to this, to lend to this effort. So visual phasing is a process. Now, I can make this bigger, or is it fine like it is, or should I make this bigger?
It might help if you can make it bigger.
All right, so let's see if it doesn't go wacky on me when I try that.
Yeah, no, mine went wacky on me.
Okay, so did anything happen here?
Much better.
Okay, so visual phasing is a process that could be of help because in Southern Maryland, we're dealing with a heavily endogamous community. And by that, we're talking about a lot of people over a long period of time, all related multiple different ways. The term was used earlier, compounded DNA, or multiple ways, or name changes. All these things are impacting what we're going to be having to struggle with as we're trying to make some sense of some of this. In my own family, my own 4 grandparents, 3 from St. Mary's County and 1 from Calvert County, they're all within a stone's throw of one another. And so over the many years, you can imagine that they're not going to be just related once or twice or 3 times. These people are related multiple times back and forth. You need a scorecard to keep up with some of this. And so endogamy can certainly tip the scale. And one of the other things that I've been working on is trying to bridge the gap back to Africa. And those connections are good because going back many generations, we're dealing with small segment matching segments in many cases in order to make those African connections. And so that can be an equally challenging dilemma to have to deal with as well. So if we begin to employ some aspects to help balance the scales, and if you're fortunate enough to have tested your parents or even your grandparents, man, you're way ahead of the game. If you didn't get an opportunity to test any of those folks so that DNA can help lead you back further back along your lines, but you do have living siblings that will agree to test. If you've got a number of living siblings, say 3, 4, 5 or more, those siblings can combine to help you make up for the DNA test that you weren't able to do on your parents. And if you've got a number of cousins, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th cousins that you can get into the game, they can help you further tease out DNA and begin to even see some of the grandparent specific DNA as you're looking at the locations of DNA in the various chromosomes. So some of these advanced techniques can be of help. You certainly want to swim, hunt, and fish in multiple lakes. The many testing companies out there, some have different strengths, some have stuff that maybe you would prefer to see done a little better. But if you bring all these things together and just draw on all the strengths of these companies, you can get the best out of all the worlds that they offer. And it's certainly advisable to try to do that. I talked about if you've got siblings, test them, and I've tested all of mine. I'm grateful that they all agree. But in addition to getting them to test, you want to test your aunts, your uncles, your nieces, your nephews, your cousins on your paternal side, on your maternal side. You want to go up and down the line as far as you can with as many people who are willing to cooperate, because then you can begin to tease out that hemispheric DNA, separating your parent's side, your father's side DNA from your mother's side. If you're fortunate enough to get more than just your immediate family into the hunt, where you've gotten 2nd and 3rd and 4th cousins in the game, now you can begin to tease out DNA and even get to the grandparent level of detail. So that's what visual phasing allows you to be able to do, to use all of those cousins to end up coming up with and identifying specific amounts of DNA that's been inherited by you, the grandchild, through a process called genetic recombination. And that allows for you to be able to see the origin of that DNA. And I like to use a graphic that shows the tug of war at the grandparent level. I like to say it's a knife fight. They're not being nice. They're both pulling and struggling to try to dominate and win the inheritance that they pass down to you, the grandchild. And so as you go up and down the 23 chromosomes, sometimes grandma might win the fight. Sometimes grandpa might win the fight. Sometimes it might be about an even struggle. And so your DNA is going to reflect that movement back and forth as these grandparents on both the paternal and the maternal side struggle. And it's not just going to be your DNA that this is happening to. It's going to be happening to all of your siblings. So it's a dynamic process that's going on with all of your siblings, such that when the dust settles and the smoke clears, if you're able to get all of your siblings into the game and go through all 23 chromosomes, both on the paternal and the maternal side, so 23 pairs, but 46 lines, if you can get all that into the game, now you have a sense for the cards that were dealt. to your individual family members. And you can use that knowledge to perhaps further go back in time. We all know that the verbiage about getting 50% of the DNA from your mother, 50% from your father. And that would be the case again if you're dealing with just yourself individually or all 5 siblings in a group. But wouldn't it be much more beneficial if you can see one generation back from the parents to the grandparents level, where you can see the individual breakouts of DNA at that level? It's going to help you to better know where your DNA is going on these various lines. And once you're back at the grandparent level, the sky's the limit. There's nothing that you may not be able to accomplish if you can get back to this level of detail. I like to always say that the elephant in the room is always the genetic recombination. You can't sleep on that. You have to have an appreciation and understanding for that. And if you can keep up with how your DNA is being divvied out from those four grandparents, it's going to give you an opportunity to go much further in your discovery. So I'll stop there. And if there's questions about that in a general sense, then perhaps we can kick that around and talk about it. But we're trying to use visual phasing, triangulation, other advanced techniques to get into the specific locations of where these chromosome matches are. And since Ancestry has the biggest account of all the testing companies, we love having those databases. We love having people who make trees and build back their trees in Ancestry. But the fact that they don't have the chromosome browser doesn't allow for us to do that last piece, that last critical piece, which is to be able to see the DNA specifically, where it's located on the paternal side or the maternal side of a given chromosome, where specifically on that chromosome. And then you can look at your own holdings and figure out from that whether or not you're seeing matches that will help you identify a most recent common ancestor that can then help you validate and codify some of the great work that's being done in some of the other lanes that you've heard being talked about here tonight. So that's kind of what I've been trying to do, is work on some of the techniques, come up with some approaches that might help us so that when and if we get to a point where we have a Mahoney name or a Yorkshire name or a Hawkins name, and we've got this living person who has come downhill, and we've got the tree that maps their way back to that 1838 manifest or some of the other manifests that are out there, we can then help tie all this together with some codifying DNA so that we can really lock this thing down and put some more rigor to some of our discovery. So I'll stop there and entertain any questions that might be out there, if any.
David Patterson, you had a question, comment?
Yes. As Jerome said, you only get 50% DNA from your mother and 50% DNA from your father, estimate, which means to the audience is that you will not receive 50% of your father's DNA or 50% of your mother's DNA, which means you will not connect to 50% if you're on Ancestry or 23andMe or one of the DNA testing platforms. You will not connect to 50% of your mother's DNA or 50 relatives or 50% of your father's relatives. And that's why it's important to have, as Jerome stated, to have your relatives, like your siblings, tested, because they may have some of the DNA that you have not received from your parents. So that's the only comment that I had.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jerome. Anybody else had any questions for Jerome? Okay, then we have Dante up next. Dante is going to talk to us a little bit about some of the other Catholic families in Maryland.
Yeah, so one of the things researching Maryland history is really understanding the families associated with the churches, specifically those that were attached with the Jesuit missions. For instance, Newtown Three of the biggest plantation owners surrounding Newtown were the Gardner family, the Lilburn family, and the Cole family. The three largest lands all met and were near Compton, which is just right across Clements Bay from Newtown on one side, and then just north of Newtown, driving towards the present day Newtown State Park, which was the previous Jesuit plantation. St. Indigo's, the biggest families surrounding that area were the Smith, the Lee, the Langley, the Jones, Briscoe and Biscoe, and the Causey, which is Causey or Causine, but pronounced Causey, and the Tennyson families were the huge Catholic families on the southern end of St. Mary's. When you get into Charles County, you get a mix of still the Cole family, the Gardner family, the Neal family, then you get the Hammersley, and you get a lot of the Briscoe and the Brooke family. The Brooke family in particular is very heavily connected with the Darnall, the Carroll, the Diggs families, a lot of intermarriages amongst those families, as well as with the McCubans, which brings you up into Anne Arundel County area. A lot of those families also had a lot of land dealings with each other. They were the witnesses to each other's land transactions, their wills, anything that they did. So when you're looking in the records and you're wondering where a lot of the enslaved got to the Jesuit plantations, a lot of those families donated our ancestors as their offering. It's hard to think about it that way, but that's how a lot of, outside of, the huge bequeathment from the Charles Carroll himself, and then Ashton, but a lot of those families gave their enslaved as their offering, if you will, to those Jesuit plantations. The other thing too is keep in mind with where the plantation sat, which was on the water. A lot of them were near the waterways because that was the heaviest mode of travel back in the 1700s and the early 1800s. And so a lot of those DNA connections that people also are seeing, not just in Southern Maryland, but the Eastern Shore, as well as the Panhandle portion of Maryland, which gets into Frederick County, Washington County, get out into that area, and then also the northern neck areas of Virginia. So Westmoreland County, Northumberland County, King George, Caroline, and then even when you go further inland, you start getting into the other counties that a lot of the DNA connections are there, but it's understanding the migration patterns. The other interesting point with the Catholic families as well is the Popal Law that took place in the 1700s, which pretty much banned the practice of Catholicism. So keep in mind, we were a British colony. The British was the Church of England because of the whole separation, because of King Henry and wanting to get a divorce. The Church of England came out. So to practice Catholicism in a British colony was treasonous. So they did it very secretly. So there's a lot of movement between Southern Maryland, Eastern Shore into Northern Virginia, hiding out, if you will. So if you're looking at those DNA connections and you're wondering, how did my family get over into Virginia when they were supposed to be in Maryland, or vice versa, a lot of back and forth between that area with those families that I mentioned, because they were large landholders. So then you get into Also the sharing of the enslaved with those famous presidents that we know, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison. You get into that mixing and everything up and down the Potomac and the Patuxent River itself. So just keep that in mind when looking at the data. And if you ever come across something and you get that wild card and you go, it doesn't fit. It might fit. It's just finding the other pieces of the puzzle that leads you there. As Cousin Jerome said, even on the DNA side, that whole recombination is the same with their migration. It's the same with the land holdings. Before you know it, you're looking at the same family. They were just in two locations and at the same time. That's where your overseers came in, or that's where the eldest son, or another portion of the property was bequeathed to the daughter when she married as a part of her dowry. So keep that in mind with those large Catholic families. And they were very prominent Catholic families. Huge ties to the church, and then huge ties to when Georgetown was founded. And being big on history and the migration patterns, that could really help you, pinpoint those DNA connections that don't make sense, but make sense when you get into the data.
Thank you. Did anybody have any questions for Dante? And folks in the chat, if you have questions, I will read your question on here as well. Thank you so much, Dante. And then Roy, you wanted to share something about Liberia?
Yes, thank you, Karen, and thanks to Dante and everyone who actually spoke here. This is fascinating. What I want to say is that if you are a Liberian actually listening out there as we are actually broadcasting live, Liberia actually plays a very big part into this whole research, into the DNA research. I myself, after I did my DNA test, I've came to realize a lot of things that I did not know about. And I stumbled upon this group, and thanks to Karen for graciously inviting me for all the stuff that we seen. If you know the history of Liberia, a lot of slaves, right, within the 1800s were actually sent from the United States to go to Liberia. That whole connection is actually intertwined. You have the slaves that went back to Liberia. Also, they were actually marrying each other. So you had endogamy also happening in there. And then they also had to marry into different tribes, and build different families. So when you actually come and do your DNA research, you realize that you are actually matching with a lot of people on the other side of the aisle, and a lot of African Americans who actually never stepped foot in Liberia. You also have families back in Liberia that you really didn't know, right? But the key thing here is that you might be holding a piece of that puzzle that we're actually looking for, right? So we can only do this together. So if you can actually just have an ancestry or one of those things, do your DNA test. If you want to do your family research, we are all here to help you. And trust me, you will find things that you never knew before.
Thank you, Roy. And I just want to thank everybody who has presented tonight. I just want to make a couple of more comments regarding the DNA connections, because I get messages all the time from people who realize that they're connected to one of the Georgetown Memory Project DNA kits. One of the things you can do is, if you don't know if you have a DNA connection at all, if you have tested on Ancestry, pull up your DNA results. In the section that lets you search by username or match name, put in Georgetown. If you have a DNA connection to some of those kits that were the people who were tested by the Georgetown Memory Project, some alphabets will show up in that section. And those are DNA matches that you have of people whose genealogy has been traced back to being a descendant of people who were sold by the Jesuits. That's just a small number. I don't even know how many it is, maybe 30 or so kids. There are many, 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 many more people whose genealogy has been researched, and they are indeed descended from people who were enslaved by the Jesuits, whether they were sold to Louisiana or enslaved in other locations. Now, having a DNA connection alone is not enough to say that you too are a descendant of Jesuit enslavement. It has to be more than just that one DNA connection. In fact, if you are matching someone who's a Mahoney or a Butler or a Hawkins, there's no way you're only going to match just one or two people. You will match many, many other people, and you will also see clusters of people who, if you match a Hawkins or a Butler or a Mahoney who has roots in Louisiana from that 1838 sale, you will see a large cluster that keeps repeating no matter which one of those matches you click on. And you click shared matches, you're going to see the same groupings of people. If you're not seeing that same groupings of people, it is more than likely that your connection is on one of their other lines. And keep in mind, people can have many, many other DNA lines that you are matching them on. If you are looking at a connection that goes back to your second great grandparent, you're looking at 16 different ancestors that could be. Well, we know some of these connections, especially if it's a low DNA connection, we could be going back to 7 and 8 great grandparents. You're looking at 512 if it's 7 different great grandparents, or 1,024 people that it could be. So you still have to do the research, look at the geography, look at some of the other historical documents you can find that may put your family in the same location of these people who were enslaved by the Jesuits. Again, if it's the GU-272, those are the ones who actually were sold in that 1838 sale. You can find more information about them at the Georgetown Slavery Archives. They have many documents related to that sale. They don't have as many documents related to so much of the history, especially some of what Dante talked about and what Kevin talked about. There are many people who were enslaved by the Jesuits in Maryland who were not a part of that sale, who were sold off to other slaveholders in Maryland and other slaveholders in other places across the country. So it is necessary to do the research. Don't just look at a DNA connection and think, oh, that's it, I'm a descendant. Because I see that all the time. People say, oh, I'm a descendant, but they haven't done the work to actually prove that they are indeed a descendant. So please, join us. If you have a DNA connection, send a message through Facebook. Send an inbox message on Facebook so that I can add you to the notification list so that you can join us on Thursday nights so that we can work through your DNA connection. That's the purpose of the Thursday night calls, is to work through your connections to try to figure out if you are indeed a descendant. Many people who join us on Thursday nights also find that they're learning a lot, because we learn a lot through each other as we are working through these matches. So on Facebook, Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement, send an inbox message, and so that I can send you notifications of the Thursday night calls if you find that you have a DNA connection to someone who was enslaved by the Jesuits, and some of those you find through the Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement. Others you find by looking at the 3 parishes the people were sold to in Louisiana: Ascension Parish, Terrebonne Parish, and Iberville Parish. And then also, if you have deep connections to some of those counties in Maryland that was spoken about, Charles County, St. Mary's County, Prince George's County, Anne Arundel County, Frederick County, if you have some DNA connections to that area, along with some of the surnames that come from that surname list, reach out to us and we'll work through those connections on the Thursday call. And just listening to the presentations tonight, it's very clear that our history is American history. And when we do our family history research, we can begin to see those connections to other historical figures. I think Kevin mentioned the Carroll family. I have learned so much American history just by being on these calls. I started these calls just to kind of keep us together with doing, connecting to each other. And I have learned so much from Jerome from being on these calls. And so if others want to share anything about what they have learned, just put your little hand up and I'll call on you. And I just appreciate everybody for sticking with it all these times, because some of y'all have been here almost from the very beginning. So that's really appreciative. Anybody else want to share anything about what they've learned? Shelby?
I just want to say it is amazing to be a part of this group. I'm still trying to find my connection. I've been with you guys for many years and I'm related to quite a few of you, and it's been amazing to just sit with my family and learn about this history together. We're always sharpening each other with the skills that we learn here, and it's a community. And what I've learned is that you can't do this work alone. Before I was sitting in my house by myself trying to figure out how I was related to all these people. And if it wasn't for this group, I would not know half of what I know. I will be eternally grateful for what I've learned here. Even if I never find my connection to the GU 272, I have met family here. And that has been what the call is all about, right? What we feel in our spirits about what we do here is it's the call of our ancestors. It's the call for justice. It's the call of reconnecting our families, and that's what we do here, regardless of whether or not you end up being a descendant or not. It is important that we do this work together because we cannot do it alone, and our ancestors are pushing us and cheering us on. And so please don't stop ever doing this work, because it is extremely important for us to know our history and have our ancestors being called, out loud again, for them to be remembered and to be remembered as a part of making this country. I never would have understood how deeply ingrained we are to this nation if it wasn't for this group here. And so I just want to always shout us out because we do amazing work here, and I hope that more people will join us.
Thank you, Shelby. David?
I would like to echo what Shelby just said. I was doing a lot of research on my own. I was heavily into 23andMe and GEDmatch. But when I joined this group, it really opened up my eyes to the concept of collaboration. Like Shelby said, you can't do this alone. And I hope, and it really helped me, and I learned from everyone in this group, the importance of collaboration, because I'm originally from Maryland, but we had no idea of our Maryland roots. Our history is basically in Alabama, and that was it. Just collaborating with this group, I'm almost been here for a year, helped me understand that the Alabama connections connected to Maryland. Also, it really helped me with my GU 272 research, where I was able to learn about different connections and how it connected to my family. And also I started collaboration with my immediate cousins who were doing their own research in my immediate family. Everybody here is my cousin. And bringing all that together helped me connect the dots to Maryland and also to the GU 272 connection. So I really encourage everyone who is listening on this broadcast to join this group, because it really will help you with your research. It will help you break down many of the brick walls. I had a lot of brick walls, and being with this group over almost a year has helped me break down a lot of brick walls, helped me connect a lot of dots that I had no clue about. And I am from Maryland, by the way, but it helped me understand our Maryland roots and Maryland history. So I encourage everyone to join our Thursday night group, because it will be very impactful to understanding your roots. And
Thank
that's
you,
it.
David. Dante?
Yeah, I think the one thing that this group has done, as both Shelby and David said, is it has given us more awareness of the connections and the multiple ways that people can connect. Also, I think it goes without saying, truly, much thanks, love, and adoration to Karen for creating this space and giving us a place to come to communicate, to collaborate, and to support one another. I think that's one of the biggest things I know for myself. And the one thing that this group did for me was when I came to the grips of Paul Not Paul, and working through that. This was the first group that I shared that with. I didn't even share it with a lot of my immediate family just because of many different reasons. But this space, the space that Karen has created here, is a safe space. It's a space of inclusion, and it's a space of collaboration. So for me, I'm truly grateful for that, and grateful for all of you.
Thank you, Dante. Roy?
Yeah, I want to echo that, Karen. I know you actually will get tired of hearing us saying that, but you are actually the mother of this group. And we are going to actually, put that crown on you tonight as the mother of this group, because you have done great things bringing this group together. And this group now is actually like a family. I love the collaborations, and I just wish I had a brain of Jerome and Kevin. But in due time, I think we all will, right? Because they rub off on every one of us here. And David and everybody actually contributing. Just the collaboration alone on Thursday. Every time I miss this call, I actually, I'm not happy about it, right? And my family actually took notice, me, my immediate family, that they gave me a very good gift now for Christmas, a lot of DNA kits. So thanks. I want to thank every one of you. I appreciate it. I'm doing a lot of deep research myself, and I have a lot of questions, and this group is actually getting me there.
Thank you, Roy. We do have a couple of questions from the chat. Our sister Regina Calloway, for Dante, she says, so how do you advise Louisiana lineages to research their connections to Maryland?
I would start with go back in your lineage as far as you can, and start looking for those ancestors that has a parent or grandparent that was born in Maryland, and start researching everything, not just where they lived, but where they worked, who were their neighbors, and start looking for patterns. And then also, don't ignore the naming conventions. I think that was something that was spoken of earlier, because our ancestors, they left breadcrumbs. I believe they left breadcrumbs for us to find one another, but to also put the puzzle pieces, our family, back together again. So the naming convention is very important, and don't be afraid of the records.
Absolutely. And then the other question was from Sister Regina for Roy. Oh, did I lose that question? Roy, what are some of the surnames you've come across with your Liberian connection?
So some of the surnames, I know for sure I have cousins that have documents on their surname, like the Colemans and stuff that we can trace. But all the surnames that we actually mentioned here can be found in Liberia. Every one of them, right? Okay. There have been a lot of intermarriages in Liberia. We have documents for the folks that actually went to Liberia, the original folks. Some people went, some came back, some have families. The intermarriage and stuff between the natives and the settlers are But those same surnames that we have, that every one of us has on this call today, you can find all those surnames in Liberia. Now, the question now is, how do we actually bridge the gap, right? And there are ways that we are actually going about doing that. Looking first at the folks who originally went to Liberia. And then from my side, I have a few friends that we actually working with to see how we can do the mapping through DNA of those different intermarriage connections. And then we begin to actually tie that up here as well. So there are a lot of research actually going on. But no surname, Liberians have surnames, the same surnames that African Americans have. Most of it.
All right, thank you, Roy. David?
Yes, I like to piggyback what Roy said. I happen to have Liberian relatives, and he's actually dead on. I didn't realize until Roy really came to our meetings about the Liberian connection, and of course, back into the US. I was aware of some of the history, but I connected to Liberian fourth cousins, actually. And some of them were in Liberia, and some came back to US, some went to Liberia. So that is a very important link to our research. So I really agree with what Roy said, because I have a lot of Liberian connections.
All righty. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And hopefully, as we come up with some more discoveries, if we are able to solve some of the hard puzzles we're working on, these family history puzzles, we'll come back with another live call. But if you think that you have some connections to this history, please reach out to us on Instagram, Jesuit Enslaved, on Facebook, Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement. And with that, I want to thank you all and good night. And good night, everyone in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us.